right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. On behalf of our owner, Mitchell Kaplan, and the entire Books and Books family, I want to welcome you to the store tonight, and thank you for coming out. Tonight, I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Shlomi Dinar, Associate Dean of the FIU Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, and they're going to give a warm welcome to the author tonight. So, round of applause, please.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jack, for that wonderful welcome on behalf of Books and Books. On behalf of the Stephen J. Green School of International Public Affairs at FIU, I want to welcome you to our gathering this evening. Our Dean, John F. Stack Jr., could not be here tonight, but he sends his warmest regards to you all. Tonight, we are presenting the latest event in our Blanka Rosenstiel lecture series on Poland, an integral and dynamic component of our European and Eurasian Studies program. We are very grateful for the generosity of Lady Blanka Rosenstiel, who has made this programming possible for the last 12 years. It has been a rewarding relationship that has contributed so much to our students, our faculty, and of course our community. Thank you. The series explores the extraordinary contributions of Poland and Polish culture to Europe and the world, both past and present. Over the years, we have engaged with many scholars, public intellectuals, artists, and writers who have all shared remarkable stories of Poland's impact on human history and civilization. We are also grateful for the ongoing partnership with the American Institute of Polish Culture and the Honorary Consulate of the Republic of Poland in Miami, both of which have been integral to the success of the series. Before we hear from our guest speaker, John Pomfret, I would like to invite Beata Pasic, the director of the American Institute for Polish Culture, to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. It is my pleasure to welcome you all at this event. I would like to welcome everybody on behalf of Lady Blanka Rosenstiel and our board and everybody who is involved with the Institute. And it is always a pleasure to work together with FIU. As Dean mentioned, we have formally had Blanka Rosenstiel lecture series for 12 years, but have collaborated from the inception of FIU. I am very happy and would like to thank all of the people who always collaborate with us. Thank you, Jeanette, Dana, Pedro, and Christina for always being ready to do something that I hope is very enriching. I am very happy to be back at Books and Books. Our first event here was 22 years ago, and I also want to thank all the staff for making it possible. Thank you, Vanessa, for always being ready for events like that. Vanessa is our executive assistant at the Institute. And thank you, Tom, for filming it. I hope you will remember, I don't like my profile. The Institute is all about sharing the rich heritage of Poland and Florida and beyond. We organize and sponsor many cultural and educational events, and there's one that's coming up on April 5th, which is the Warsaw Philharmonic Orchestra is coming to Miami and will be performing in Arsht Center with the winner of the International Chopin Piano Competition. So as you leave, there are flyers. I wanted to show you. They look like this, that I hope you will take with you and be able to get the tickets. The Institute is also about highlighting Polish-American relations, interesting Polish-American relations. And today, we're going to highlight an unlikely alliance between Poland and the United States, as told by the American writer, John Pomfret. John is an award-winning journalist who worked within Washington Post for decades. He is an expert on China and was a foreign correspondent covering the wars in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Congo, Sri Lanka, and Iraq. When he was working on the Bosnia conflict, he was stationed in Warsaw, and this is where he came upon this story that he put in his book. When I think of the title, From Warsaw With Love, I think it's very apropos of today's times. I think if we could say it, looking at the world today, we should say, From Poland with Love, in reference to what Polish nation is doing for Ukrainian refugees who are fleeing their country after the invasion of Russia. There are many ways to help, and if you would like to spread the love with Poland, we also prepared flyers who show organizations with whom you can work. And now, without further ado, I would like to present John Pomfret, who came to visit us all the way from California. He will talk about his book and will also engage with a discussion with you. Enjoy and thank you.
Thank you first to Books and Books and to FIU and to the American Institute of Culture and Beata Paschitz. We've been emailing frantically over the past few months, so I'm really glad we could do this. It is my talk today, my book today actually does fit into the Rosenstiel's idea of highlighting Polish American and Polish culture and Polish American relations as well. It's just, if you've seen the TV, you might have seen Vice President Harris being in Warsaw today. Just imagine 40 years ago, one could never really think of Polish and America as being allies. That was in the middle of the Cold War. Even 30 years ago, the idea of Poland being on the front line of a Russian invasion of another country was sort of gobsmackingly bizarre as well. But here we are. And Polish-American relations hopefully are as close as they've ever been, although who knows what's happening with that kerfuffle around the MiG-29s. But this kind of brings me to sort of the subject of my talk today, which is how did Poland and America become allies? Because allies aren't just made kind of by nature. They actually have to work together and become allies. And I wanted to get into part of that story because to try to get to that story, I want to bring you back to March 1st, 1990, when a CIA officer by the name of John Pomfret shows up at the embassy of Poland in, of all places, Lisbon, Portugal. And Pomfret is a 6'3", brawny guy. He joined the army, actually, in the early 1950s because he wanted to fight in Korea. And he thought he wanted to be part of a tank battalion. He didn't realize that 6'3" and very brawny, he couldn't fit into a tank. The Army actually had different ideas for him. They said, you're actually quite bright. You might not want to go into tanks. Why don't you go to the Army Language Center in Monterey, California? And he got off the bus there, and the guy looked at his name and said, Palevich, is that Polish? And Palevich said, yes, it's Polish. He said, oh, we have an opening in Polish studies. You're going to go study Poland and Polish. And so his life changed over time. He left the Army, became a CIA officer. And at the time, he was a really senior case officer. Over the course of his career, he had managed 18 Polish agents. So he was very deeply involved in the CIA's penetration of Cold War Poland. He knew literally, and this is not simply hyperbole, he knew actually where the desks were placed inside the SB, the Polish Ministry of Interior. So he had such a granular knowledge. And so he shows up at the Lisbon embassy asking for a fellow by the name of Ryszard Tomaszewski. And Ryszard Tomaszewski was technically a consular official at the time. In reality, he was a senior Polish spy, and he'd been involved in many operations against the United States, including one where he suborned a Silicon Valley engineer named James Harper and got a huge trough of details about the American Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile system. So he was basically asking for Tomaszewski. He gets ushered into Tomaszewski's office, and he announces himself. He said, "Mr. Tomaszewski, my name is John Palovich. I'm a senior CIA officer. Our nation wants to end its Cold War with your nation. Can you transmit a message to Warsaw on my behalf?" Tomaszewski erupts. He says, "What are you doing in my office? I'm just a consular official. I know nothing about spying. How could you be talking in an office like this? The walls have ears." Palovich said, "Relax. Portuguese counterintelligence is known to be relatively sleepy. They're not going to find anything out. And by the way, I know you're an officer, and here's your career." And he basically details all the parts of Tomaszewski's life, like you were married twice, you have 2 sons, one from each wife. You were posted in Moscow and Brazil and Mexico City, where you did that Harper case. By the way, great tradecraft. We won't hold it against you. But please transmit my message. Tomaszewski erupts again, says, "I can't believe you're talking about this. This is crazy. I'm no spy. Anyway, who do you want me to contact on your behalf? I don't know any of these people. Write down their names." And so Palovich then writes down the names of all the senior leaders of the Polish intelligence agency, starting with Czesław Kiszczak, who was the Minister of Interior, going to Henryk Jaszczyk, who was the head of foreign intelligence. And Tomaszewski's looking over his shoulder, and he's speaking to himself. He's like, this American is pretty impressive. He's not misspelling any of these people's names. I mean, given the challenges Americans have spelling Polish names. So Palovich writes down the names, hands the list to Tomaszewski, gives him his passport, and Tomaszewski Xeroxes his passport and his calling card on which he's written his home phone number. And then Palovich is summarily kicked out of the embassy. Palovich's approach to Poland happened at this amazing point of Polish history, and the Polish people in this room lived it, so you know better than me. But this incredible point of Polish history, both in terms of how Poland was imagining what its security would be like as the Soviet Union was kind of creaking, and what its political system would be like in Poland domestically as well. And at the time, there were many different ideas for how Poland could kind of become safe in this new world that was being born. There were some ideas that basically said we should get rid of the Warsaw Pact, get rid of NATO, and demilitarize all of Europe and all live together with flowers and love songs. And that was people like Václav Havel, who was a poet, playwright, president of the Czech Republic, really believed in that idea. Other people, like Tadeusz Mazowiecki, who was a prime minister of Poland, came from the Solidarity trade union movement. He was a dissident. He backed the idea that perhaps Poland should have a small alliance with Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and they themselves could protect each other against, sandwiched as they were between Germany and Russia. People pushed back against that, saying that's a little bit idealistic as well. And Mazowiecki even said, well, look, we might want to think about letting the Soviet troops, and at that time 250,000 Soviet troops still occupied Poland, we might want to let those Soviet troops stay in Poland because we see just to our west, Germany is uniting. And what's going to happen if a united Germany is going to start saying, we don't recognize our border with Poland, we want the ex-German cities back, right? During the Second World War, Breslau, which is today Wrocław, was the 4th biggest city in the German Reich. Thousands of Germans were moved from their homes when Stalin created new lines between these countries. And so that maybe we should keep a good relationship with the Soviet Union. We don't really know. So Palovich enters this debate. The CIA approach enters this debate just as it's going on. And then domestically, the Poles were battling over this idea of, okay, we're communism's dying, but we're creating this new government. And what is this government going to be like? And how should we treat the communists? Should we punish them? Should we start Poland at sort of ground zero and purge all the communists and fire them from the police, fire them from the intelligence agencies, get rid of them from the bureaucracy and start Poland at a new year zero? Or should we have a large tent and bring the communists in? And the CIA enters that debate as well, because the CIA's point was don't dismantle your foreign intelligence agents because they're very good. There are basically 3 reasons. First, they were extremely good. The CIA had been given, the Polish spies had been giving the CIA headaches for years. James Harper was one case. There was another case of a super spy by the name of Marian Zaharsky, who, based in Los Angeles, had stolen huge amounts of American early stealth technology, bringing it back to Poland. So the Americans had great respect for the Polish tradecraft, even though they were working on the other side. But they basically wanted them to change their hats and begin working for us. And the second reason is because people like Palevich had deeply penetrated Polish society with their agents, so they knew these people. And third, the Poles had outposts in places around the world where the Americans couldn't go. They had an embassy in North Korea, they had an embassy in Iran, they had an embassy in Cuba. And the CIA looked at that and drooled and think, well, if we can get our people in there, maybe as Polish agents or whatever, we can work together and gain a lot of information. So that was another motivation as well. And finally, the Poles had a vantage point on the USSR, which was still in existence, that the Americans couldn't get. They had deeply penetrated, they really understood the Russians as well. And the CIA was very interested in getting their hands on that type of information as well. And so after the meeting, Tomaszewski fires back a cable to Warsaw, and Warsaw gets it. Czesław Kiszczak, who is the Minister of Interior, gets it and basically says, we've been waiting for this, because already his friends in Hungary had told them that the American outreach was going to happen. And immediately, Kiszczak tells Tomaszewski, call Palevich back. Get him out, get him. And so several days later, Palevich is shaving in Bethesda early in the morning. He gets a phone call and says, by the way, this is Tomaszewski. This is basically, the guy says, this is Lisbon calling. I'm sorry that I was a little rude to you, but would you mind coming back, along with several of your colleagues? And so the Americans sent a small delegation back to Lisbon at the end of June, and then they send a larger delegation to Warsaw that summer. Then cooperation basically is kicked off. And the CIA cooperation with the Polish intelligence agency plays into the broader debate in Poland about what type of security system do we need. And slowly but surely, the idealistic ideas of demilitarization and having just a small alliance begin to be pushed off the table, partially by the ex-communists, because these were fellows who had been working for Russia and been very close to Moscow, but they also understood, because of their Leninist training, that power was really key. And Poland couldn't stay in the middle of Washington and Moscow. It had to lead into one side. And if it wasn't going to lean to Moscow, it had better lead to Washington. And so the ex-communists in the intelligence agency were eager for cooperation. And so when the opportunity came, starting in October of 1990, the two agencies did a massively important joint operation. I'm not going to tell you about it because you have to buy the book. This is an advertisement, and which created a blood bond between the two services. And from then, it was off to the races. The Poles worked for the Americans all over the world, risking their lives in Libya, in North Korea, in Iran, in Cuba, in Iraq, and other nations, and also in, of course, Mother Russia as well. And in fact, the station chief, the Polish station chief in Moscow, stayed there from 1990 to 1996, and he was highly respected as one of the best foreign spies ever to have worked in Moscow. And the relationship was so close that by 2001, then CIA Director George Tenet, in writing a letter to his Polish counterpart, Bogdan Libera, on the eve of his retirement, said in the letter, with your nation, the United States has forged the second most important espionage cooperation relationship the United States has ever had. And if you consider the fact that the U.S. has had, of course, the first would be Britain. That was the assumption. But if you consider the close relations the United States had with the Mossad, with the Australians, with the BND in West Germany, that's quite some praise. So, another interesting thing is, finally in 1999, Poland joins NATO. And over the course, and intelligence cooperation played a significant role in convincing the Senate to vote overwhelmingly in Poland's favor. There were other factors as well, clearly. A wonderful ambassador was based here for 6 years named Jerzy Kosminski, and he did huge work on that. But the intelligence was really Poland's kind of ace in the hole, because they couldn't really justify the alliance along military grounds, because the Polish military just wasn't as advanced as it could be. But in intelligence cooperation, it was enormously important as well. Another issue we have to remember is, people have said right now, looking at the crisis in Ukraine, some people, that the trigger really was NATO enlargement. And we kind of Putin was forced into a corner, and he had no other choice, and he had to do this, which is a bit ridiculous. But if you think specifically about Poland, its involvement and its enlargement, its ascension to NATO membership, created much more security in Europe than it had previously. Previously, Germany was on the fringe of Europe. But once Poland joined, NATO's was extended 440 miles to the east, which created a huge amount, much more security for Germany than it previously would have had. So I think that's also important to remember that NATO enlargement wasn't simply against Russia. It was also to make sure that Germany stayed stable and didn't roam around Middle Europe like it had in the past. So with that, I'd like to sort of end my comments, and I'm happy to take questions from you about what's going on right now, anything related to China, if you want to talk about that, because it's a player too. But thank you again for having me. Sure.
In hindsight, was Ukraine ever really seriously considered for NATO?
Not. It wanted to join NATO, but there's a lot of, I mean, the U.S. government and its NATO partners set out a whole list of must-haves and must-dos, both for Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, and then for the Baltic states as well. And NATO and Ukraine never really hit that, partially because corruption was so deep, and then the democratic transition was pretty rocky. There was also issues with the Ministry of Defense not really being civilian and being more controlled by the military than it should have been. So they had a ways to go. Yeah.
You asked us to ask you about China. What are your thoughts on that?
Involving Ukraine? Well, the Chinese have talked about being a mediator, but I think they're just kind of talking about it. They're not really deeply involved. If they wanted to be deeply involved, they would be doing something like what the Israeli Prime Minister is doing and actually going and talking with people. So they're very interested in supporting Putin, but they're also very interested in not looking like they're supporting Putin. But they're still going to support him, and they're going to break sanctions, because this for them is an opportunity to weaken the West. And I think they were a little surprised by the fact that the West is united on this issue. But their main interest has always been to split Europe from the United States. But the problem is that Europe and the United States have now become closer. The question is, we're still early days, and I think they're hoping over time that relationship will become more fraught, so they'll be able to gain things from that.
With the purpose of further moving west, with the Russian creating more the Soviet Union again?
Well, I think that I think Xi Jinping knew that Putin was going to invade Ukraine, but he believed Putin when Putin told him that it was going to be easy and fast. But I think that they're comfortable with a stronger Russia because ultimately they believe their economy is so much stronger that Russia's going to need them more than they're going to need Russia. And already you see when Putin came to the Olympics, the Russians signed a gas deal with China at a very low price. And so the Chinese are using that leverage. And now in the situation where their sanctions are hitting, the Chinese are going to be able to come into Russia and sort of treat Russia kind of like a petrochemical satellite almost, and be able to take its oil and gas. And because Russia doesn't, other than that, Russia's economy doesn't have an economy. And even more so now that sanctions are hitting.
It's also a good test ground to see how they can get into Taiwan.
Exactly. So this is a really interesting potential lesson. I mean, and they can learn from Putin's failures. I mean, Taiwan is much more complicated. Well, it's simpler and more complicated. One, because it's a sea invasion, but the second problem for Taiwan, it doesn't have a strategic rear, right? It can't bring its troops west because they're going to fall into the Pacific. So there's difficulties there. Sir?
Say 103 years ago, the Ukes and the Poles were killing each other. Do you recall?
They were.
There's even a law school in modern time that I believe is southeast Poland that teaches Ukrainian law and Polish law on an international context, which shows a dramatic change, of course. By keeping this wonderful change in mind and what we see today was pretty obvious. I'm leading up to this. Do you see Poland still as a key to how Central and Western Europe may act, how NATO may act, how the EU may act? Perhaps believing Poland today has a greater influence than it did 6 months ago, a year ago, 5 years ago.
Well, certainly, especially because they're taking the brunt of the refugee crisis. Now it's up to some 1.4 million. They really are a frontline state, so they completely have a seat at the table. Secondly, the pipeline that's bringing refugees out is the same pipeline that's bringing weapons in, and that's a pipeline that goes over Polish territory, so they're involved in the security aspect. Thirdly, Poland's governmental relationship and its security relationship with Ukraine was probably the closest of all the nations in Central and Eastern Europe. They were deeply involved in helping to train Ukraine's army and also involved in intelligence cooperation. So I think those three kind of factors really push Poland into the forefront of the conversation about how to deal with this crisis. I mean, Poland has sort of disappeared for a while. And the interesting thing is, though, this crisis has also helped Poland and the EU kind of deal with some of their problems. So there was an issue with respecting EU law that the Polish government pushed back against, and it looks like that's going to be much more easily solvable than it was several months ago. So hopefully this crisis can push our societies to at least pause our culture wars for a while we deal with the larger threat, which is Vladimir Putin.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And the kerfuffle.
What?
The kerfuffle.
Well, I mean, who knows, right? Poland had a completely legitimate point. I don't know, and I don't know the backstory, whether the Americans did or didn't know that Poland was basically saying, hey, we'll fly them to Ramstein and you deal with them after that. This is talking about the MiGs. Yeah, and so I'm not aware. All I noticed that I saw Kamala Harris's press conference, and she at the beginning looked highly uncomfortable when that issue was raised. But it also could be that she's a relative rookie when it comes to these type of moments. So, but the reality is, though, that Poles are very creative people. Living under Stalin, living under the Soviets, you had to be, and so getting a MiG into Ukraine would be probably something that they could do, but announcing it, making it very public, probably wasn't the best look. And if Vladimir Putin starts doing something like sending cruise missiles in the direction of a Polish airfield, we're then really off to the races. And I don't think anyone wants to go there.
Just one comment on that.
Yeah.
I think I did hear speculation that Poland wanted to send the MiGs directly to Ukraine, and then somewhere down the pipeline there was a threat that if Poland does that, Russia will consider an act of war. So that was the creative, maybe kerfuffle that occurred.
Yeah.
Like, well, if we send it directly, this may occur. So they were like, okay, we have to act quickly. We're going to send them to Germany, and then they do the delivery.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that I heard with speculation.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it would still be an act of war. So yeah.
And then now a question.
Yeah.
What do you think or does Poland have any role or a large role in any of the intelligence in regards with the rivalry with the U.S. and China?
So Polish officers have worked on behalf of the United States. They've worked sort of on behalf of the West in dealing with Chinese spies in Europe. There was a Chinese spy who was involved in monitoring Tibetans in Sweden, and the Polish intelligence officer caught the guy, and he was expelled from Sweden. And then secondly, there was a Chinese agent working for Huawei, which is a big telecommunications company in Poland that the Poles captured. And I think the Americans were involved in that operation as well, because he was trying to get into, because Huawei has a lot of business in Poland, and they were hoping to get into Poland's system in order to be able to get from there into that of the U.S. to get intelligence about Poland's relationship with America. But Poland cooperated in that case as well. So,
I have a question about the refugees, because Poland has been very generous in taking in the amount of refugees that
Yeah.
there are, but like Ukraine's infrastructure has been totally destroyed,
Yeah.
and so it's going to take a lot of money to build it back, and Russia has none.
Yeah.
So they're not going to agree to that. And I know Ireland is already, taken a wave of them, and now they'll be coming to the United States. That's only going to weaken the Ukraine nation, both
Yeah.
with a lack of infrastructure and less people.
Yeah.
Population.
Yeah, I think that's going to be, if the war stops soon, that would be a great problem to have. But if it keeps on going, there's going to be so much more destruction and death that will seem like a small problem, But the issue is trying to get it to stop as quickly as possible, and everyone is a little bit. And you just don't know what Putin's thinking, and if he can be stopped. So, sir.
So I've read today that EU is actually applying sanctions against Poland. That they have an issue that I think something in the constitutionality that they're not recognizing.
Right.
That EU law as supreme.
Yeah.
So do you see that being an issue?
So I've heard that the negotiations are still moving in that on a positive way, on that issue, and they've kind of been accelerated because of the crisis, and both sides want to solve that so we can deal with this much larger problem. To my point that I'm hoping that this crisis with the invasion will prompt both Poland and the EU to give a little, to get a little, so we can maintain united against the far bigger threat. We can argue later.
It seems like a weird time to bring it up now.
Well, it's been going on for years.
Yeah.
So.
Do you think the intelligence cooperation would have happened eventually, if they hadn't been that meeting at the consulate in Lisbon?
So the CIA was very interested in specifically Palovich, and Palovich was this extraordinary character. He was never really an administrator. He just stayed a case officer all his life. And he worked under a guy named Paul Redman, who was the deputy director of operations for Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And they were very interested in cooperating. And there was another guy named Milt Bearden who had been working in Afghanistan and had come into the director of our operations working in that area, who really pushed this idea of, before these guys dismantle their intelligence agencies, let's get there and let's get them not to dismantle the agencies and have them work for us, particularly the Poles, because they were so good. And so I don't really know whether the historical negative, if Palovich hadn't done it with somebody else, but Palovich was really a peculiar guy. He was known in the agency as Mr. Poland. He knew everything about them. He knew all these guys, and in negotiations with his Polish counterparts about the cooperation, he was often face to face with a guy who'd worked for him as his agent during the Cold War, which was kind of gave him a little vertigo, right? Because he had to pretend never to have met the guy before, and when in reality he knew intimate details of his life. So I think Palovich was really a key character in creating that relationship and making it so. And after this great operation that I won't tell you about, in October 1990, William Webster, who was then the CIA chief, came to Poland on his first visit of a CIA director to Eastern Europe. It was a secret visit at the time, and they went to Krakow and they went to the old city and they had this big dinner and this, one of these palatial Soviet-era diners, and one of the Polish spies got up to toast, and he said, "Here's to John Palovich. He tried to bring us in one by one, and he succeeded in bringing us all over at the same time." And to Palovich, that was the highest honor of his life, right? Because he really had been working one by one to get these guys to work for us, and a lot of them did. But then he got them all in the end, to come over.
So these intelligence officers that you're writing about in this book, do you know if any of them are working the situation today?
None, they're all retired. Well, there's a couple guys who are, but most of them are retired. Yeah, there are a couple of them been brought back. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry.
Does Poland's intelligence agency have any hand in any relationships that we're trying to create with Iran right now?
So they, in the early 2000s, when the Bush administration was trying to determine how advanced Iran's nuclear weapons program was. Polish officers were in Tehran and actually on the outskirts of Tehran at Iranian nuclear installations, dropping something called a rock, which was this piece of equipment that collected air samples. And it was an extremely sensitive piece of equipment, and it could detect the presence of uranium-235, which is used in enrichment. And they could actually they could determine where the uranium came from, what percentage it was being enriched to, and all sorts of things. And they were really very much involved in this operation on our behalf, because we couldn't do it. And obviously the Israelis were working this as well, but the Israelis were more into kind of assassinations. That's not the way the way the Poles played, but they were really involved deeply in trying to determine the level of Iranian nuclear program. I haven't heard anything since then, but they were in the 2000s. They were really and it went from Bush into the Obama administration as well. And then tragically, a Polish military attaché died in a kind of bizarre accident in Tehran, in a traffic accident. He was run over by a car, and there's been rumors that perhaps this was some type of a payback, but nothing's been confirmed. So. There.
Since the start of it, I was wondering about the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. And I know that eventually it expired, but when it expired, the U.S., if I'm not mistaken, said that they would still honor that deal, which I'm not sure why the U.S., if they said they actually honor it, they didn't go in. Because a deal is a deal, so I feel like it makes them look really bad. In the future, no one ever will make a deal with the U.S. anymore. No one's going to give up their nuclear weapons, including Iran, right? So.
Right.
I was just wondering from the beginning, like, they had a deal, and the U.S. looks really weak right now, just from that point. I'm not saying it was a good deal, but a deal is a deal, so.
And, there's no doubt that the United States is, even, if you look at the Ukrainian invasion in the light of America's invasion of Iraq, that's problematic as well, also. And there were hundreds of thousands of Iraqi refugees as well. So, these things are not simple. So I take your point completely.
Your pronunciation of Polish names is pretty good. I'm wondering how much Polish you learned.
So my Serbo-Croatian was okay because I spent so much time in Bosnia, but my Polish is lousy, and this whole book would not have been written without. I had a great interpreter and friend named Alex Nowatsky, and he just was marvelous. So, yeah. And I would go drinking with these guys, and they just would make fun of me. So in order not to have to take another shot of vodka, I had to get the name right.
What year was your book published?
October last year.
Oh.
Yeah.
And was it translated into Polish?
It will be out in Polish on March 24th.
Oh, really?
Yeah, published by Znak. Yeah.
What do you think the relationship or situation is going to be with Poland and Belarus in the near future?
So that's a great question. Belarus seems to be owned and occupied by the Russians now, right? And so I think it's going to be a difficult relationship. The Poles had the best intelligence on the whole presidential election stuff. The Americans relied on them heavily because their penetration is very deep in Belarus, just like it is in Russia. But they were, sort of dismayed by the direction Lukashenko has taken his country. So I think it's going to be tense. But in thinking about this, like, we now have Poland as a member of NATO. Can you imagine what this crisis would be like if Poland wasn't in NATO, right? And if the Russian troops were on Belarus's border with Poland and not Ukraine? It's just, on the doorstep of Germany. That just creates still. So to all those people who say that NATO membership enlargement was the trigger and it caused all the crisis, you could also say, thank God they actually enlarged and these countries are in NATO. Because the whole security of Europe would be at risk.
So do you think that the border between Belarus and Poland right now is like a front line, or is Belarus in any way a buffer state, or could potentially be a buffer state if this invasion doesn't go as Putin's way, and then maybe things calm down?
Well, that would be one's hope, but the Belarusians, Lukashenko is causing mischief all the time, and he just most recently he flooded the border with Iraqi refugees into Poland, which was just crazy, right? But he was also, but he has Putin's playbook, which is to sow discord and chaos on your borders in order so that you can look good and you can control the situation. So I think until he goes, it's going to be a difficult situation between Poland and Belarus. Yeah.
I've been debating in my mind whether to raise this, and I don't know if it's fair to do so.
Please.
Let's do it. In today's Wall Street Journal, there was an op-ed suggesting Lviv be looked upon as protected as Berlin was, and President Truman with the candy bombers, etc., helping Berlin survive. One can debate amongst themselves whether they think the Europeans, the United States, have the leadership that Harry Truman had. We don't need to go there. But conceptually, do you see any merit, and this is where I'm really getting into whether I'm fair in asking you this, of looking at Ukraine and the region there to go in and to protect it in the way Berlin was. And the author is a long time and likely highly respected writer with the Wall Street Journal. I think we could all probably say that, despite what our personal feelings are.
Yeah.
That what is the merit in that? And his point being, too, this would give Mr. Zelensky credibility as a place to remain.
Mm-hmm. So I think that it's an attractive idea. The problem is that once NATO begins to engage, then the worries of the wider war spill out. And I think that it has a certain attractiveness to it. At the same time, you can also see lots of potential problems with it, especially if Putin takes a wider war to Europe. And I think right now the general push is to try to de-escalate as best as possible. And if he refuses, then I think all options should be on the table. But right now, I think the most important thing right now is to help women and children get out and help weapons get in. I think one of the keys to this, tragically, is that you have to kill more Russians. And that's tragic, and that's too bad, but I think that's the key right now. So you need to be able to have that pipeline moving in. And luckily, so far, he hasn't moved that far west. Now, he might and he could, but he's still very much in the south and in the east. And so...
Do you believe, somewhere it was reported years ago that Putin suggested to the Poles, you turn it back into Lvov, west, and we take the east.
Yeah. I think
river.
I think Putin has probably suggested a lot of things to a lot of people. I mean, his game is mischief and chaos, right? That's what he traffics in, because that's how he can maintain power. So don't doubt that he probably threw that as an idea. Thank you. Great. Well, thank you very much. A bit of a grim topic for a Thursday evening, but.
Any questions?